The Wyoming wind cut through Jacob Miller's worn coat like a blade as he hammered another loose board back onto the fence post. 23 years old, and already his hands looked like those of a man twice his age, scarred, calloused, weathered by the relentless prairie sun. The Miller Ranch stretched out before him, 2,000 acres of stubborn grassland that his father had died trying to make profitable, and his mother had followed him to the grave trying to keep. Now it was just Jacob, the silence, and the endless work that came with running a cattle ranch alone in 1887. The sun was setting behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and crimson, when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong. Not the familiar lowing of cattle or the whisper of wind through dry grass, but something else, something struggling. Jacob dropped his hammer and picked up the kerosene lantern from the fence post, its warm glow cutting through the gathering dusk. The sound came again, closer now, a labored breathing, the scrape of hooves against hard earth. "Easy there," he called out, his voice carrying across the empty plain. "Who's out there?" What emerged from the growing darkness made him catch his breath. A mule, its grey coat dark with sweat and dirt, stumbled toward him with an uneven gait. The animal's left front leg bore a gash that gleamed wet in the lantern light, and its breathing came in harsh, desperate gasps. But it was what the mule carried that made Jacob's heart race. Strapped to its back were worn leather saddlebags, their edges frayed and darkened with age. A bedroll was tied behind them, and from one of the bags a corner of yellowed paper peeked out like a flag of surrender. Jacob approached slowly, speaking in the low, gentle tones his father had taught him. "Easy, old friend. Easy now." The mule didn't shy away. If anything, it seemed to lean toward him, as if recognizing salvation when it saw it. There was no rider, no sign of anyone who might have been traveling with the animal. The dirt road that ran past his property showed only the mule's tracks, leading back into the vast emptiness of the Wyoming territory. "Where's your person, boy?" Jacob whispered, running his hand along the mule's neck. The animal was trembling with exhaustion, its eyes reflecting a kind of desperate intelligence that made Jacob's chest tighten with sympathy. He led the mule to the barn, its hooves echoing hollow against the wooden floor. As he lit the oil lamp hanging from the center beam, warm light spread across the hay-strewn space, revealing his two horses watching with curious interest from their stalls. Jacob worked by lamplight, cleaning the mule's wound with careful hands and wrapping it with strips of clean cloth. The animal stood patient and still, as if it understood it was finally safe. When he offered water, the mule drank deeply, desperately, and Jacob realized it had probably been wandering for days. "You're staying here tonight," he said, settling the mule into an empty stall with fresh hay. "Tomorrow we'll figure out where you belong." But as he turned to leave, something made him pause. The saddlebags sat heavy and still where he'd placed them, but one of the buckles had come loose during the mule's ordeal. Papers had spilled partially out, and in the lamplight Jacob could see handwriting, careful feminine script that seemed oddly familiar. His hand hovered over the papers. Opening someone else's belongings felt wrong, like a violation of trust. But what if these documents held clues about the mule's owner? What if someone was looking for this animal, worried sick about what had happened to their companion? Jacob picked up the papers with hesitant fingers. The first was a letter, its envelope addressed in that same careful script. "To whoever finds this mule, please read. Your life may depend on it." His hands began to shake as he unfolded the letter, the paper crackling in the silence of the barn. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the loose boards and making the lamp flame dance. The mule watched him with intelligent eyes, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The letter began, "My name is Catherine Walsh, and if you are reading this, then I am likely dead." Jacob's heart hammered against his ribs as he read Catherine Walsh's words by the flickering lamplight. The barn felt suddenly smaller, the shadows deeper, as if the weight of someone else's secrets had pressed the walls closer together. "My name is Catherine Walsh, and if you are reading this, then I am likely dead." This mule, Samuel, has been my faithful companion for 3 years, and I have trained him to seek help if something should happen to me. If he has found you, then you are my last hope, not for my life, but for justice. I have spent the last 2 years gathering evidence against the Garrett Land Company, who murdered my husband and stole our homestead through forged documents. The proof is in these saddlebags, along with documentation of 12 other families they have cheated out of their land. They have killed to keep these secrets, and they will kill again if these papers don't reach the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. The man leading this operation is Vincent Garrett, son of the company's founder. He has bought judges, threatened witnesses, and worse. But I have their contracts, their false deeds, their correspondence admitting to the murders. Everything you need to stop them is here. Please, whoever you are, take these papers to Marshal Hayes in Cheyenne. Tell him Catherine Walsh kept her promise. Tell him the evidence he needs is finally here. And know that if you do this thing, you will have given justice to families who died, believing justice would never come. Trust no one from the Garrett Company. They have eyes everywhere and will stop at nothing to recover these documents. But you have Samuel now, and he knows the safe routes to Cheyenne. He will not fail you as he did not fail me. May God bless you for your courage. Catherine Walsh, December 1886. Jacob's hands trembled as he set the letter down. The date was 3 months ago. This woman had been dead for 3 months, and her mule had been wandering ever since, carrying evidence that could bring down killers. He opened the saddlebags with careful hands, his breath catching at what he found inside. Document after document, each one telling a story of greed and murder, forged land deeds with the true owners' names scratched out and replaced. Contracts showing payments to men with reputations as hired guns, letters in Vincent Garrett's own hand discussing permanent solutions to stubborn homesteaders. And there, near the bottom of the second bag, Jacob found something that made his blood run cold. A land deed for the Miller Ranch, dated just 2 weeks ago, with his father's signature forged at the bottom and Vincent Garrett's name written in as the new owner. "No," he whispered, staring at the document. "No, this can't be real." But it was real. The signature was close enough to his father's handwriting to fool someone who didn't know better, but Jacob could see the subtle differences, the way the M in Miller curved too sharply, the way the final R didn't quite match his father's distinctive flourish. They were coming for his ranch. The Garrett Land Company had already laid the legal groundwork to steal everything his family had built, everything his parents had died working to preserve. According to the date on the forged deed, he probably had days, maybe weeks, before they showed up with false legal documents and men with guns to back them up. Samuel the mule shuffled in his stall, drawing Jacob's attention back to the present. The animal was watching him with those intelligent eyes, and Jacob could swear he saw understanding there, as if the mule knew exactly what those papers meant. "You've been carrying this burden for months, haven't you, boy?" Jacob said softly, reaching out to stroke the mule's neck. Waiting for someone who could help. He spent the next hour going through every document, memorizing names and dates, understanding the full scope of the Garrett Company's crimes. 12 families murdered, dozens more threatened and driven off their land, a network of corruption that reached from small-town judges all the way to the territorial capital. And now Jacob Miller, orphaned rancher with a struggling cattle operation and no family to mourn him if he disappeared, was the only one who knew the truth. As dawn approached, painting the sky pale grey through the barn's small windows, Jacob made his decision. He couldn't stay here and wait for the Garrett Company to come for his ranch. He couldn't pretend he'd never seen these documents, never learned what had happened to Catherine Walsh and all the others. He had to get to Cheyenne. He had to find Marshal Hayes. He had to make sure these bastards paid for what they'd done. But first, he had to prepare for a journey that might be his last. Because if Catherine Walsh was right about the Garrett Company having eyes everywhere, Then Jacob Miller was about to become a marked man. He gathered supplies methodically: jerky, hardtack, coffee, ammunition for his father's Winchester rifle. He saddled his best horse, a sturdy buckskin named Thunder, and prepared Samuel for the journey ahead. The mule seemed to understand what was happening, standing patient and ready as Jacob secured the precious saddlebags. As the sun rose fully over the Wyoming prairie, Jacob took one last look at the ranch that had been his whole world. The cattle grazed peacefully in the distance, unaware that their owner was about to risk everything for people he'd never met, for a justice that might never come. "Come on, Samuel," he said, swinging up into Thunder's saddle. "Let's go find Marshal Hayes." What Jacob didn't know was that Vincent Garrett had already learned of Catherine Walsh's mule going missing, and he had already sent men to find it. The morning sun cast long shadows across the prairie as Jacob and Samuel made their way east toward Cheyenne, Thunder's hooves beating a steady rhythm against the hard-packed earth. Jacob had chosen the old cattle trail that ran parallel to the main road, less traveled, but also more exposed. Every instinct told him to hurry, but pushing the animals too hard would only slow them down in the long run. Behind them, the Miller Ranch grew smaller with each mile, until it was just another distant speck on the vast Wyoming landscape. Jacob tried not to think about whether he'd ever see it again. They had been riding for 3 hours when Samuel suddenly raised his head, ears swiveling toward the south. The mule's muscles tensed, and he let out a low, warning snort that made Thunder dance sideways nervously. Jacob pulled up, scanning the horizon with sharp eyes. At first he saw nothing but endless grassland and scattered sagebrush. Then, maybe 2 miles away, he spotted the dust cloud, thin and grey against the morning sky, moving fast in their direction. "Riders," he muttered, his hand instinctively moving to the Winchester strapped to his saddle. "Too many riders, moving too fast to be casual travelers." Samuel pawed the ground anxiously, and Jacob realized the mule had been through this before. He'd probably seen Catherine Walsh run for her life, maybe watched her die defending these same documents that now rested in Jacob's saddlebags. "Easy, boy," Jacob said, though his own voice was tight with tension. "We're not caught yet." He spurred Thunder into a gallop, with Samuel keeping pace despite his injured leg. The mule's determination was remarkable. Even wounded and exhausted, he seemed to understand that the papers he carried were worth any sacrifice. The dust cloud behind them grew larger, and Jacob could make out individual riders now. 4 men, maybe 5, riding hard and gaining ground. Professional riders on fresh horses, not ranch hands out looking for strays. "Garrett's men," Jacob said through gritted teeth. "Has to be." The landscape ahead offered little in the way of cover. Just rolling grassland and the occasional stand of cottonwoods near a creek. But Jacob knew this country better than any hired gun from back east. He'd grown up here, hunted here, learned every hidden gulch and rocky outcrop from his father. He veered north toward Willow Creek, where the land grew rougher and the trees thicker. If he could reach the creek bed, he might be able to lose them in the maze of eroded channels and thick brush. Thunder's breathing grew labored as they climbed a steep rise, and Jacob could hear the thunder of pursuing hooves growing closer. When he crested the hill, he risked a look back and felt his heart sink. 5 riders, all armed, all pushing their mounts hard. The lead rider was a big man in a black hat, and even at this distance, Jacob could see the glint of metal at his hip. "Vincent Garrett himself," Jacob breathed. He'd seen the man once before, at a cattle auction in town. Tall, well-dressed, with the kind of cold eyes that suggested he'd killed before and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. The creek was still half a mile away when Thunder began to stumble. The horse was giving everything he had, but Jacob could feel the animal's strength fading. Behind them, Samuel kept pace with grim determination, but the mule's injured leg was starting to affect his gait. They weren't going to make it to the creek. Not at this pace, not with their animals tiring. Jacob made a split-second decision that went against every survival instinct he had. He pulled Thunder up short at the edge of a small stand of rocks and dismounted quickly, grabbing his rifle and the saddlebags containing Catherine Walsh's evidence. "Samuel, come here," he called, and the mule trotted over immediately. Jacob transferred the saddlebags to his own horse and gave Samuel's neck a firm pat. "You've done your job, boy. Now it's my turn." He slapped Thunder's rump, sending the horse galloping away north toward the creek, with Samuel following. With luck, the riders would follow the horses and give Jacob time to find better cover. Jacob scrambled up into the rocks, finding a position where he could see the approaching riders while staying hidden. His hands were steady as he worked the lever action on his Winchester, chambering a round. He'd been hunting since he was 12 years old, and his father had made sure he could hit what he aimed at. But this wouldn't be hunting. This would be killing. Men, not deer. Human beings with families and lives of their own. Even if they'd chosen to work for killers, the riders crested the rise at full gallop, and Jacob got his first clear look at them. Vincent Garrett in the lead, just as he'd suspected. 4 other men, all wearing the kind of clothes that said they weren't ranch hands, city clothes, expensive boots, gun belts that showed signs of regular use. They pulled up when they saw the riderless horses heading toward the creek, and Jacob heard Garrett's voice carry across the morning air. "Damn it, Morrison, I told you to shoot the horse, not chase it." Garrett's tone was cold, professional. "Now we've got a man on foot with evidence that could hang us all." "He can't have gone far on foot," replied one of the other men. Morrison, apparently. "We'll spread out, flush him out." "No," Garrett said sharply. "Those documents are too important to risk in a firefight. We corner him, we negotiate, offer him money, a new start somewhere else. If that doesn't work—" He left the sentence hanging, but his meaning was clear. Jacob watched them dismount and begin moving through the rocks in a loose search pattern. They were experienced at this. No wasted motion. No unnecessary noise. They moved like soldiers or like men who'd hunted other men before. His finger tightened on the rifle's trigger as Morrison appeared between 2 boulders, maybe 50 yards away. An easy shot. Jacob had hit prairie dogs at twice that distance. But killing a man, even a man who worked for murderers, wasn't something Jacob Miller could do in cold blood. Not yet. Not unless they gave him no choice. "Jacob Miller!" Garrett's voice echoed off the rocks. "I know you're out there, son. I know you found Catherine Walsh's mule, and I know what's in those saddlebags, but you don't have to die for some stranger's vendetta." Jacob said nothing, trying to track the positions of all 5 men as they worked their way through the rocks. "I'm prepared to offer you $5,000 for those documents," Garrett continued, his voice getting closer. "Cash money. Enough to buy yourself a new ranch somewhere else. Hell, enough to buy 2 ranches. All you have to do is walk away. $5,000. More money than Jacob had ever seen in his life. Enough to start over anywhere, maybe find some green land with good water and build the kind of operation his father had always dreamed of. But then he thought about Catherine Walsh, dying alone with only a mule for company. He thought about 12 families murdered for their land. He thought about the forged deed in those saddlebags, the one that would steal his own ranch if these men weren't stopped. "I've got a counter-offer, Garrett," Jacob called out, his voice carrying clearly across the rocks. "You can go to hell." The response was immediate. Gunfire erupted from 3 directions as Garrett's men opened up on his position. Bullets spanged off rock and whined through the air, sending chips of stone flying. Jacob kept his head down and waited for the firing to stop. When it did, he heard Garrett's voice again, no longer friendly or negotiating. "Burn him out, boys. We'll take the saddlebags off his corpse." The acrid smell of smoke began to drift through the rocks as Garrett's men set fire to the dry grass around Jacob's position. Within minutes, the wind would carry the flames into the rocky outcrop, forcing him out into the open where their rifles waited. Jacob clutched Catherine Walsh's saddlebags against his chest and tried to think. He could surrender and hope Garrett kept his word about the money, but everything in those documents suggested Vincent Garrett didn't leave witnesses alive. He could make a run for it, but that would mean abandoning the evidence and letting murderers go free. Or He could stay and fight, probably dying in the process, but maybe taking one or two of them with him. None of the options seemed particularly appealing. The smoke was getting thicker now, and Jacob could hear the crackle of flames spreading through the dry grass. In the distance, Thunder and Samuel had stopped by the creek, watching the smoke rise with the kind of intelligence that made Jacob wish animals could testify in court. "Last chance, Miller," Garrett called out. "Walk out with your hands up and the saddlebags in plain sight. You'll live to see another sunrise." Jacob was about to call back with another refusal when he heard something that made his heart leap, the sound of many horses approaching fast from the south. Not the measured pace of Garrett's men, but the thundering gallop of riders in a hurry. "What the hell?" Morrison's voice cut off abruptly as a rifle shot echoed across the prairie. "Garrett! Vincent Garrett!" A new voice boomed across the landscape, carrying the kind of authority that made men stand up straighter. "This is U.S. Marshal Hayes. You and your men are surrounded." Jacob nearly laughed out loud with relief. Somehow, some way, the cavalry had arrived. He could see them now through the smoke. A dozen riders in a loose circle around the rocky outcrop, all armed, all wearing the badges of federal lawmen. "Marshal Hayes," Garrett called back, and Jacob could hear the carefully controlled panic in his voice. "I'm afraid there's been a misunderstanding. We're pursuing a horse thief who—" "The hell you are," Hayes interrupted. "I've got a telegram from the territorial governor himself, Garrett. Something about evidence of land fraud and murder, evidence that was supposed to be delivered to me personally 3 months ago by a woman named Catherine Walsh." The silence that followed was so complete that Jacob could hear the wind whistling through the rocks and the distant snorting of horses. "I don't know what you're talking about, Marshal," Garrett said finally, but his voice had lost its confidence. "Maybe you'll remember better in a jail cell," Hayes replied. "Vincent Garrett, you're under arrest for land fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and about a dozen other charges I'll think of on the way back to town. Drop your weapons and step into the open." Jacob heard the sounds of a brief scuffle, followed by Garrett's voice rising in anger. "You have no evidence, no proof of anything. This is all speculation and hearsay." That was Jacob's cue. He stood up from behind the rocks, saddlebags in one hand and rifle in the other, and called out, "Marshal Hayes, I've got your evidence right here." The marshal was a lean, weathered man in his 50s, with the kind of steady eyes that suggested he'd seen every form of human stupidity and survived to tell about it. He rode over to Jacob's position while his deputies kept their guns trained on Garrett and his men. "You'd be Jacob Miller," Hayes said as he dismounted. It wasn't a question. "Yes, sir." "And these," Jacob held up the saddlebags, "belong to Catherine Walsh. Everything you need to put Garrett and his company away is right here. Land deeds, contracts, correspondence admitting to murders, even a forged deed for my own ranch." Hayes took the saddlebags with careful hands, his expression growing darker as he examined the documents. "Jesus Christ," he muttered after reading Catherine's letter. "I've been hunting these bastards for 2 years, and this woman had everything I needed the whole time." "How did you know to come here?" Jacob asked. "How did you know we needed help?" Hayes smiled grimly. "Got a telegram yesterday from an old friend of mine in Laramie. Said a young rancher had ridden into town asking questions about Vincent Garrett and the territorial marshal's office. Said this young man seemed nervous, kept looking over his shoulder, and paid for his telegram with silver dollars that looked like they hadn't seen circulation in years. The kind of old silver Catherine Walsh was known to carry." Jacob stared at him. "But I never went to Laramie. I never sent any telegram." "No," Hayes agreed, looking past Jacob toward the creek where Thunder and Samuel stood watching the proceedings. "But I'll bet that mule of yours knows the route to Laramie better than most people, and I'll bet he's got the kind of training that would let him carry out his owner's instructions, even after she was gone." Jacob turned to look at Samuel, understanding flooding through him. The mule had been to Laramie before, probably many times with Catherine Walsh, had been trained to seek help from the law if something happened to his owner. Even wounded and exhausted, Samuel had remembered his training and made sure help would come when it was needed most. "That animal's worth his weight in gold," Hayes said admiringly. "Catherine Walsh was a hell of a woman, and she trained herself a hell of a mule." The marshal's men had Garrett and his gunmen in custody now, hands cuffed behind their backs and looking like they'd seen their own hangings. Garrett kept insisting there was no evidence, that it was all a misunderstanding, but his protest sounded hollow even to himself. "What happens now?" Jacob asked. "Now we ride back to Cheyenne, and you testify to a federal judge about how you came by these documents," Hayes said. "Then we round up the rest of the Garrett Land Company, judges, clerks, hired guns, the whole rotten network. Thanks to Catherine Walsh and that mule of hers, we're finally going to see justice done." As they prepared to leave, Jacob walked over to where Samuel stood by the creek. The mule looked up at him with those intelligent eyes, and Jacob could swear he saw satisfaction there, the contentment of a job finally completed. "You did it, boy," Jacob said softly, stroking the mule's neck. "You kept your promise to her. You got the evidence to the marshal, just like she trained you to do." Samuel nuzzled against Jacob's shoulder, and for a moment Jacob felt a presence that was almost like Catherine Walsh herself, a sense of approval, of gratitude, of a promise finally kept. 3 months later, Jacob Miller stood in the courthouse in Cheyenne, watching as Vincent Garrett was sentenced to hang for 12 counts of murder. The entire Garrett Land Company network had been dismantled, their stolen lands returned to rightful owners or their families. Jacob's ranch was legally his again, free and clear. More than that, the territorial government had offered him a substantial reward for his role in bringing the criminals to justice. Enough money to expand his operation, hire help, maybe even start a family of his own someday. But the real reward stood in the pasture behind his house, growing fat and content on good grass and regular meals. Samuel the mule had earned his retirement, and Jacob made sure he wanted for nothing. Sometimes, especially in the evenings when the light was just right, Jacob would see the mule standing by the fence, looking west toward the mountains with a kind of peaceful satisfaction. Catherine Walsh had been avenged, justice had been served, and a loyal mule had finally brought his burden home. The morning sun painted the Miller Ranch in shades of gold and green as Jacob Miller walked across the yard toward the expanded barn, a steaming cup of coffee warming his hands. The ranch looked nothing like it had 5 years ago. Where once there had been broken fences and struggling cattle, now there were sturdy corrals filled with prize-winning stock, a new bunkhouse for his 6 hired hands, and pastures so green they seemed to glow in the early light. But it wasn't the prosperity that made Jacob smile as he approached the fence. It was the sight of Samuel, now grey-muzzled and moving with the careful dignity of an elder, standing in his favorite spot by the gate where he could watch over the entire operation like a benevolent supervisor. "Morning, old friend," Jacob said, reaching over the fence to scratch behind Samuel's ears. The mule leaned into his touch with a contentment that spoke of absolute trust and deep affection. At 28, Jacob had filled out from the lean, desperate young man who'd found a wounded mule on a dark prairie night. Success suited him. His shoulders were broader, his face had lost its haunted look, and there was a confidence in his bearing that came from knowing he'd faced the worst life could throw at him and come out the other side. "Mr. Miller?" a voice called from behind him. Jacob turned to see Tommy Morrison, the youngest of his ranch hands, approaching with a letter in his hand. "Ryder just brought this from town, says it's from the territorial capital." Jacob took the letter with mild curiosity. Official correspondence still made him nervous, even after all these years. Too many memories of forged documents and stolen land. But when he opened it, his eyes widened with surprise. The letter was from Marshal Hayes, now promoted to Chief Federal Marshal for the Wyoming Territory. Jacob read it twice before the words fully sank in. "What is it, boss?" Tommy asked, noting Jacob's expression. "They want to name a town after Catherine Walsh," Jacob said slowly. "There's a new settlement growing up around the railroad depot about 40 miles east of here. The territorial legislature wants to call it Walshville in honor of her service to justice. They're asking if I'll speak at the dedication ceremony." Jacob looked at Samuel, and the mule seemed to understand. His ears perked forward with interest, and he snorted softly, the same sound he'd made that first night when he'd recognized Jacob as someone who would help. "What do you think, Samuel? Should we go pay our respects to your Catherine?" The dedication ceremony 2 weeks later drew people from across the territory. Jacob had never seen so many folks gathered in one place. Homesteaders, ranchers, town merchants, and federal officials, all come to honor a woman most of them had never met, but whose courage had touched their lives. Jacob stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd, with Samuel grazing peacefully in a nearby field. The mule had insisted on making the journey, despite his age, as if he knew this was important. "Catherine Walsh never lived to see justice done," Jacob began, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd, "but she made sure justice would find a way. She trusted a faithful mule and a stranger's conscience, and that trust changed everything." He told them the story, how Samuel had found him that night, how the evidence had survived 3 months of wandering, how a woman's determination had reached across death itself to right the wrongs done to innocent families. "This town bears her name," Jacob concluded, "but it's built on something more than that. It's built on the idea that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose courage over comfort, justice over safety. Catherine Walsh proved that, and her memory will live on in every person who calls Walshville home." The applause was thunderous, but Jacob barely heard it. His attention was fixed on Samuel, who had wandered closer during the speech and now stood at the edge of the crowd, his intelligent eyes fixed on the new sign being unveiled. Walshville, Wyoming Territory, founded 1892, named in honor of Catherine Walsh, who gave her life for justice. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, an elderly woman approached Jacob. She was small and gray-haired, but her eyes held the same determined intelligence he'd seen in Samuel. "Mr. Miller, I'm Margaret Walsh, Catherine's aunt. I came all the way from Missouri when I heard about the dedication." Jacob felt his throat tighten with emotion. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for your loss. Your niece was an extraordinary woman." "She was," Margaret agreed, then looked towards Samuel. "And that's her mule, isn't it? The one who carried her letters all this way?" "Yes, ma'am. Samuel. He's been living with me for 5 years now, and I can honestly say he's the finest animal I've ever known." Margaret Walsh walked over to Samuel, who stood perfectly still as she approached. When she reached out to touch his neck, the mule lowered his head slightly as if he remembered her scent, her voice, something that connected her to his beloved Catherine. "She used to write to me about this mule," Margaret said softly. "Said he was the smartest creature she'd ever met, almost like he could understand human speech. She trained him herself, you know. Taught him roots, taught him to seek help, taught him to be faithful no matter what." She turned back to Jacob, tears shining in her eyes. "I want you to know, Mr. Miller, that Catherine would be proud of what you did. She always believed that good people would do the right thing if they just had the chance. You proved her right." That evening, as Jacob and Samuel made camp on the journey home, Jacob sat by the fire and thought about the day's events. The new town, the ceremony, the old woman's words, all of it seemed to point towards something larger than he'd originally understood. He wasn't just a rancher who'd found a mule and some documents. He was part of a story that stretched back to Catherine Walsh's courage, and forward to every family that would find safety in the town that bore her name. He was a link in a chain of justice that connected past and future, the living and the dead. Samuel stood nearby, silhouetted against the star-filled sky, and Jacob could swear the old mule was thinking the same thoughts. They'd been through something together, something that had changed them both, and now they were guardians of a memory, keepers of a promise that justice would always find a way. "We did good, didn't we, boy?" Jacob said quietly. Samuel turned to look at him, and in those wise, gentle eyes, Jacob saw agreement, satisfaction, and something that looked remarkably like peace. The story that had begun with a wounded mule on a dark prairie night was complete. Catherine Walsh had her justice, Vincent Garrett had met his fate, and the frontier was a little safer for decent folks trying to build honest lives. But more than that, Jacob Miller had learned something about himself, that when the moment came to choose between safety and righteousness, he had the courage to choose well. It was a lesson that would serve him for the rest of his life, through marriage and children and all the challenges yet to come. And Samuel had fulfilled his promise to Catherine Walsh beyond her wildest dreams. He'd found not just help, but a home. Not just justice, but love. As the campfire died down to glowing embers and the Wyoming night settled around them, both man and mule knew they'd been part of something larger than themselves, something that would echo through generations in the stories told by families who'd found safety in a town named for a woman who'd refused to let evil triumph. It was a good ending to a hard story, the kind of ending the frontier rarely provided, but always promised to those brave enough to seek it.